I would like to apologize in advance for getting behind on videos. This has been insanity trying to keep up with everything. I'm going to do a quick video on this equivalent fraction sheet. The kids know this as Mr. Sneaky 1. And the way we talk about Mr. Sneaky 1 is that if I take any number, say 3 times 1, I'm always going to get 3. So by that same token, 3/4 times 1 is always going to be 3/4. Well, the way we talked about it is that 1 can be disguised, and we call him Mr. Sneaky 1 because he wears disguises. And the kids know this. They had one in their math notebooks, and if we had known we were going to be out of school, probably would have sent those home with them. But Mr. Sneaky 1, as long as he's wearing the same thing on the top and the bottom, he's still a 1. So even if it's a 4 over a 4, we know that 4/4 is 1 whole. So if I want to find an equivalent fraction for 3/4, I can say 3/4 times 4/4, because that's still 1. And I always have them box it so they can remember that's Mr. Sneaky 1. So then I'm just going to multiply straight across. 3 times 4 is 12. 4 times 4 is 16. So there's one equivalent fraction for 3/4. They like to do Mr. Sneaky 1 wearing a tutu a lot. And so if he's wearing a tutu, I'm going to do 3 times 2 is 6. And 4 times 2 is 8. There are lots of other methods that we talked about in class for doing this, but I think the easiest method for the kids is Mr. Sneaky 1, because, like I said, you can go in with any number. It can even be, if I wanted to do 50 over 50. Well, 50 divided by 50 is 1, so this is still technically the number 1. It's still 3/4 times 1, so my answer is going to be 3/4. We're just renaming it. So 3 times 50 is 150. 4 times 50 is 200. So 150 over 200 is also equivalent. All of these equivalent fractions are just another way to rename 3/4. It's the same exact value. We just multiplied by 1. And so that should get you through this sheet. And if I look on the back, if you're trying to figure out if they're equivalent or not, like if I were looking at this one, I would think, okay, what could Mr. Sneaky 1 be wearing here? And I would do 1/4 times 3, because I know that 1 times 3 is 3. So is 1/4 equivalent to 3/12? Yes. Another way that we talked about doing these is if they know the science and the math behind why the heart trick works, but for time's sake today, because I'm behind and I was going to try to push a couple of these out, I'm just going to show you the trick. Let's look at 4/5 and 5/10. Well, first they could use benchmark fractions and say, well, 5/10 is a half, 4/5 is more than a half, so they are not equivalent. I could also look at it and say, well, 4 times nothing is going to give me 5, except decimal, and they don't know how to do that. But 5 times 2 is 10, so this would have to be an 8 for those to be equivalent. But I can also do the heart trick, because, sorry, I got distracted on my way to the heart trick. So if I'm doing 4/5 and 5/10, I can do this. So 10 times 4 is 40, and 5 times 5 is 25. So those two are not equivalent. They are different amounts. There's, like I said, you could do the benchmarks and look at this as a half and this is more than a half and see they're not equivalent. You could figure out if Mr. Sneaky 1 would give me something equivalent. Or I can do this heart trick. I could also do a picture. I always tell the kids that pictures are not the best one, because it's really hard to get a picture to look exactly the same, to get those pieces exactly the same. And you got to compare the same whole for it to match. And they want to come in and do this, and they want to say 4/5, and they'll go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, that's 6. See, I can't even do a 5th. If they do 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if they do fifths that way, as you can see, all these pieces aren't equivalent. So it's going to be hard for them to even do a model. So I say don't do the models for this. They can if there's one provided for them, but I recommend you don't try to draw them. I always go to Mr. Sneaky 1 because remember, if it's the same number on top and bottom, that is equivalent to 1. Because if I ate 4/4 of the pizza, I ate a whole pizza. And that any number times 1 equals that number. So these are just renamed fractions that are equivalent. So stick with Mr. Sneaky 1 or benchmark fractions. Compare them to a half and a whole and see what's closest. And those are going to be your best bets to do this sheet.